In our last lecture module, we looked at the case of norm, contrasted it with the earlier cases, and I made the observation that it looks like the paper is structured like an intuition pump and that the norm cases don't seem as clear-cut or obvious as BonJour would like us to believe. In this module, we want to turn our attention to trying to defend the reliabilist. We'll start off by trying to isolate the assumption that seems to be driving BonJour's counterexamples, the separation assumption. Then I'm going to go and try to make the case that BonJour's examples all turn on mischaracterizations of the cognitive process, the timeline, the nature of beliefs, and so on. And so we'll give a basic version of reliabilism to work as our framework for thinking about these cases. We'll go back and look at the first and second norm cases. And then we'll start to consider some alternative process characterizations that are consistent with the cases as BonJour describes them and see how each of those particular process characterizations play out in terms of whether or not they help or hinder BonJour's attempt to generate those intuitions. So we'll look at one I call PM, one I call PU, and one I call PI for reasons that will be obvious enough soon enough. We'll finish the lecture by turning to this generality problem, or as I like to call it, the characterization problem. This difficulty that a reliabilist theory has to face about how to go about characterizing your process in a way that is not ad hoc or begging the question or so on. So all of the cases that BonJour introduces share this common idea. BonJour, and I think internalists generally, suppose that externalist theories like reliabilism tie the epistemic merit of a belief to properties other than one's subjective perspective or potential subjective perspective of evidential relations between the beliefs and one's other beliefs. Therefore, they assume that one can easily separate one's subjective perspective from the claimed source of the belief's epistemic merit and thereby show reliabilism doesn't capture what gives a belief its epistemic merit. Now, obviously, I'm not very sympathetic to this claim, and so I do want to try and see if we can come up with a reasonably coherent rebuttal to BonJour's claims here. So, recall that Armstrong restricts his claim to non-inferential perceptual beliefs. And so BonJour's objections really don't clearly apply until we get to the unmitigated version of norm. I think that we've got reason to believe that the unmitigated version of norm doesn't really have the ability to generate those kinds of intuitions that BonJour needs. And so in that case, I think BonJour isn't successful. However, we should consider the impact of the sorts of cases that BonJour brings up as objections to views like Sosa's or Goldman's or just reliabilism generally. On my view, all of the intuitions in these BonJour cases, though, are generated by using mischaracterizations of the cognitive process involved, vague case descriptions, and sometimes false suppositions about the nature of belief. And so I'll try and defend the general reliabilist framework by trying to argue that this is the case and showing how in detail, when we're more careful about how we characterize a process or develop a timeline or describe a case, that those intuitions don't appear in the way that BonJour would like them, even in the earlier cases. So making the BonJour cases clear requires that we make the evidence, the processes, and the timeline explicit, as well as considering the subjective perspective of the cognizers in each case in light of the evidence, processes, and timelines that we've clarified. We'll start just by giving a basic version of reliabilism. This is something like what Alvin's version of reliabilism is. So outputs of a cognitive process count as knowledge, if and only if the outputs are produced from inputs that count as knowledge by some process P in performing some task T, and the task-specific characterization of the process that produced the outputs has a high reliability in the task-specific relevance class. So we understand a process in the context of a task, we assess its reliability in the context of those sorts of situations, and then we determine whether or not something would count as knowledge or is justified on the basis of those assessments. Now, one important reason why the theory that I just presented isn't a complete theory is that a complete theory would specify what counts as knowledge for an input, and such a specification would be made as part of a recursive definition of the nature of knowledge if we adopted a definitional framework, for example. but in the places where the inputs matter, it'll be obvious how the recursive nature of the definition can supply them. However, a complete theory would have to deal with the possibility of innate knowledge, of transduced inputs, of memory, and all the details that we'd expect a robust epistemic theory to give. Let's look at that second norm case again. This case looks like the original case. Norm ostensibly has no beliefs about clairvoyance. However, BonJour introduces a false equivocation at this point to generate his intuition, or at least to try to. Norm's having no beliefs about P turns into a case where, from his standpoint, there's apparently no way in which he could know the president's whereabouts. But I think in this particular circumstance, what BonJour has done is he's taken a case where Norm forms a belief using clairvoyance, and now he's smuggled in a metacognitive appraisal of the epistemic status of that belief and substituted it in as part of the original process of clairvoyance, when we have no reason, given the description, to suppose that it is that case. So somehow, though we have no beliefs concerning P, BonJour suggests that Norm cognitively registers that P couldn't be sufficient for him to know that the president is in New York City. And I'm not really sure how Norm could accomplish this feat without further reflection, without using some other process to evaluate P or BP or his overall epistemic situation. In other words, to engage in metacognitive appraisal. And BonJour doesn't offer any explanation of how Norm could have such a subjective perspective on his belief that the president is in New York City, given that he has no beliefs about the process or about the status of the belief that he's just generated. And so I think in this case, what BonJour does is definitely introduce this false equivocation between pure clairvoyance and clairvoyance together with some sort of metacognitive appraisal of one's epistemic situation. What about the case description in which Norm's unjustified belief that P, clairvoyance, is reliable, and that belief plays a part in forming his belief about the president's whereabouts? Here it seems that a mischaracterization again emerges. The perfectly reliable process by which Norm was supposed to form the belief about the president's whereabouts was clairvoyance. The process that forms the belief about the president's whereabouts isn't pure clairvoyance. It's clairvoyance plus some other reasoning or evaluative process that involves his beliefs about P. And so again, it doesn't look BonJour is actually characterizing the process in the way that he's saying he characterizes the process. Now, we may object that, well, but we can somehow come up with a characterization of clairvoyance that includes these elements, and I will in just a bit. But as we'll see, it actually won't make any difference. As it turns out, the reliabilist doesn't even need to appeal to BonJour's mischaracterization of clairvoyance in this first Norm case. Since BonJour stipulates that the belief is about clairvoyance and it's unjustified, the reliabilist can safely assume that it doesn't count as knowledge. Hence, the recursive nature of our reliabilist definitional theory would disallow this case's knowledge anyway. But to tease out the issues concerning how we might be able to tweak clairvoyance to add various elements that BonJour is interested in, or how we might modify the case to consider the belief in light of a second process, let's go back in the next lecture module and consider the Samantha and Casper cases again.